study that was funded by the ESSC Economic and Social Research Council.
Yeah, thanks. And this was a study on LGBT equalities initiatives in local government with Surrey Monroe from the University of Huddersfield, who's there, my colleague. And we were looking at LGBT equalities initiatives in local government in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And today, in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on LGB issues. Surrey is also going to talk more tomorrow about other projects, but also this project in relationship to bi issues. So this is what we did. We interviewed local authority officers and partners in voluntary and community organisations. We did action learning sets, small groups of people, usually about 8 to 10 in each of the 4 case study areas. We had North and South England. They met 4 times over a period of 6 months. So we had 12 groups in all. And we also interviewed national stakeholders and councillors, people, national stakeholders, organisations concerned with LGBT issues. And it's important that there has been other work. Davina and Surrey and Jean Caravan have done work before in a similar area. But this study was distinguished in that we conducted it at a time when there was a rapid shift, a sea change in policy occurring, a lot of changes. The project ran between 2007 and 2010. And as we know, the policy context was very changeable in the last 15 years. Another distinction is that we were interested in including local authorities that were relatively inactive or resistant to these changes, because we wanted to look at not just implementation mechanisms that were driving the LGBT equality agenda, but we wanted to look at barriers as well and resistances, patterns of resistance to such work that could lead to an implementation gap. And again, previous research had been done, but often was focusing on areas where Brighton, Manchester, London and so forth, where there was a history of implementing work in these areas. The other areas we were interested in, I don't have time to focus on today, were tensions between equality strands, including religious and faith beliefs, and also tensions within and across the LGBT equality strand. Now, as I say, today what I'm focusing on is implementation. And what we found was that despite these national recent, or relatively recent legislative and policy shifts, there was an implementation gap, that LGBT equalities work, as you might expect perhaps, was unevenly spread across local authorities. And some of the factors that accounted for that are up here on the slide. The ones that were important in facilitating implementation of this new public duty to deliver equalities in terms of LGBT included issues such as leadership was seen as key. So it was a kind of top-down model. What was interesting, just an aside, was hardly anybody who was part of the project talked about, I think it was only one, talked about grassroots issues building on LGBT politics. It was very much seen as about leadership, managerial leadership, and by elected members, councillors and so forth. And also because of the changes in local government and an introduction of various kinds of performance measures that rated you, a bit like football leagues, as whether what grading you got on your equality status. Things like this actually were seen as quite significant, as well as having adequate resources and local partnerships. Now, where there seemed to be an implementation gap, a number of barriers and resistances to such work were apparent. Political hostility, lack of local authority interest and motivation, lack of resources, and it seemed that this kind of work was seen as different to other kinds of equality work. There was the associated stigma that people saw as attached to equalities work, but specifically LGBT equalities work. And there was also affective issues. People saw this as about things that were private, not about coming into the, if you like, as a public concern. And people, even with the best will in the world, were often talking about feeling very nervous or embarrassed about dealing with this. And some people said the LGBT acronym was useful because people didn't have to say the words. The other thing that was interesting, somebody talked about pecking order earlier. We did find that there was a hierarchy of equalities strands, and that people generally said that this was the last kid on the block, bottom of the pile, and so on. And where these combined, where you had poor resources and this low valuing and this hierarchy, it meant that LGBT work was the last thing you were going to probably get to. So there was a number of interacting issues and also the pace of change and organisational cultures around attitudes to sexuality and gender were also seen as barriers and forms of could lead to forms of resistance. Now, we found that there was a continuum of approaches to responding to the LGBT equalities agenda, and we have broadly characterised them as 5 main approaches along this continuum, representing different degrees of support, ambivalence or resistance to LGBT equalities, ranging from proactive, where individuals or local authorities were actively wanting to positively support and champion this area of work, through to compliance, to omission, erasure, and in some cases active resistance. It's important for me to state right at this moment that I'm not for one moment suggesting that conceptually these are fixed points along a continuum, rather gradations overlapping in some cases, characterisations better understood perhaps as discursive resources, narratives that both organisations and individuals could draw on to push forward equality measures or not, as the case might be. I'm just going to say briefly a little bit and give a quote to bring to life these points on this kind of moving continuum. The most common articulation of the implementation gap between policy and actual practice in local authorities was compliance. There was a frequent reference by interviewees to a tick box approach to LGBT equalities work. You know, we'll do what we have to, we'll tick a box if we have to. And this was compliance for its own sake because, again, quote, we want to be seen to be doing the right thing. And you could do this without actively supporting or achieving change. You're just doing the bare minimum to comply with the equality law. And you could see this simply as a form of organisational passivity. Okay. Or you could see it as something much more dangerous, because a number of interviewees questioned whether this was actually benign, as you can see in this quote from a manager who says you can be very effective in complying and do quite negative practice. And in this sense, it can appear that an organisation is fulfilling its public duty despite having a very minimalist approach. And there's some echoes here. Some of you will know Sarah Ahmed's work on the politics of documentation in relation to race equality. Now, the next form of resistance that we've characterised is omission. And this is where non-implementation, define it as a consequence of organisational capacity issues. We would if we could. And many of the interviews spoke in this way as LGBT equalities, quote, falling off the agenda because we just don't have resources. You know, this local authority says, you know, we're very motivated, we're also very overstretched, we're very tired. And this issue of being tired at an individual level is one aspect, because we did find that this was an important constraint at an individual level, that it was not just a lack of capacity in terms of the organisation, but in terms of the individual equalities worker or officer. This work was seen as very demanding, work and emotionally challenging. It's described in this way, and it was seen as all the more so in a context, an organisational context, where equalities work, and LGBT equalities in particular, was seen as low value. So it was seen as hard, it was seen as challenging, it was seen as embarrassing, and it was seen as low value. One person described it as, it's like career suicide, wanting to champion this. Another one said, this work takes a lot of guts to do it. So, another manifestation of omission, just briefly, was where individuals didn't challenge resistance. And you might say, you know, in that sense, again, that relates to their individual capacity, not just the organisations. And it wasn't just about the resources in this case, always, but because they didn't see challenge as effective. Here, this counsellor doesn't challenge someone who's been discriminated, because you're not going to change a person like that. So there was kind of judgment making about the resources you had to actually effect change at an individual as well as an organisational level. Now, the third form of resistance we've identified is erasure. Firstly, as a form of not seeing, linked to issues of visibility or non-visibility of not just LGBT people in organisations or society or communities, but also LGBT issues. Here, it's, well, is there a need? Do we need to be doing this as a reason for inaction? And you see this in this quote where this counsellor assumes, because it's a he in this case, has had no complaints, it means there's no discrimination in his patch. Another form of organisational passivity and individual passivity. In addition to not seeing lesbian, gay, bi, trans issues, some interviewees also raise the issue that staff would often express the view that LG people don't exist in their locality. And we found that this was more likely to be the case in rural contexts. We don't have any LGBT people. And we see that you can see this in one way as naivety, or you could actually see it more critically as a form of active resistance through an active denial of the existence of LGBT populations. And pressures of erasure can also occur in other ways through a focus on declaring an integrated approach to equality, following on from the Equality Act 2010, that actually sees erasure as a practice of disappearance. So it disappears difference, and there's this tension between equality and diversity here. What one person referred to as, well, we're introducing a diversity-neutral model approach. And here in this quote from the Equalities Manager, you can see that this person's talking about how they were told to take sexual orientation out of the document and instead just put different communities. And finally, there was evidence of resistance to change that went beyond ambivalence, where there was active opposition to LGBT equalities. This was often discussed, however, in terms of particular attitudinal resistance, in particular agents of resistance, individuals who were seen as prejudiced. And this was often linked, the construction of this resistant actor was linked to particular parties, or generally seen as right-wing, and faith communities. Primarily, we also looked at Northern Ireland, so primarily more evangelical Christian communities in the northeast as well. And also the characteristics were seen as more likely to be senior management and elected members who were older, male, white, and right-wing. And here we've got this, we don't really want to know. We don't know about it, we don't really want to know about it. We oppose LGBT equalities. Now, having outlined these, and this was also, this is an example of someone who said that they knew some, almost wore homophobia as a badge of pride. So something that's not apologising for being resistance. Now, having outlined these different forms of resistance, as I said earlier, I think it's important that we're not saying these are static fixed points, but that they're narratives of resistance that can be drawn on, and also that these are discourses that can intersect and reinforce each other. So, for example, practices of omission arising from a narrative, well, we don't have adequate resources, may be underscored in certain workplace cultures where there is a lack of leadership and motivation to do such work that manifests either as minimal compliance or erasure, so that they can embed in each other and strengthen that resistance. We also need to think about these different intersecting forms of resistance in terms of how they may attach and stick to specific issues such as housing, bullying, adoption, and so on. And that may lead to different kinds of implementation gaps. So we need to think about areas of resistance as well. For example, we found that homophobic bullying was one issue that was generally considered, quote, very difficult to argue with, and active resistance was seen as highly unlikely. Other areas, however, were more at risk of being avoided or opposed, and this was particularly apparent in relationship to adoption and fostering. It's also important to recognise that different forms of resistance that I've been describing may be more or less significant to L, G, B and or trans communities. For example, erasure was a particularly important issue in delivering equalities to bisexual people, and I know Sarah is going to talk about that tomorrow, so I won't say more about that at this point. I'm also aware, Sarah and I did a conference, an ESSE conference just before Christmas around this, that we're now in a different ballpark again. We have the coalition government, and we may need to rethink some of these issues in terms of that context politically, and also the introduction of austerity measures. And this has obviously impacted on the resourcing of work, equalities work, in local authorities. And I think it's also added to this issue of value of work. And I think that's something to do talking about sexuality here, how, say, poverty and sexuality are rarely linked, although they are clearly very linked. And how it's a bit like, oh, you're going on about LGBT equalities. It's almost seen as a luxury in the current context. And I have heard that said. And I think there's an issue there that brings a different querying around value. I think the other thing that we've seen is a lack of dilution and a lack of monitoring now of equality measures, which was seen as a driver, even if it was a tick box. One person said, well, it might be a tick box, but it still allows us to use it politically to get things on an agenda. With things like that falling off, you get a weakening of drivers that can enable forms of omission and compliance to dominate. I think my time's nearly up, so I'd just say that if you want to know more, because it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, about the project and much wider issues, we have a website up there. We also have a book out, Sarah and I know I think you've got flyers and copies. I think is there a conference discount or something? I know you're, if people are interested. Sure, okay. So I'll stop now and welcome comments and questions later. Thank you.